So clearly, we are going to continue applying this concept of wisdom, which is pretty much what James is all about. Um, James, in a lot of ways, is like it's taken right out of the Old Testament wisdom literature, like Proverbs. And so James is all about trying to figure out what it means to think like God thinks about the key things in life. All right, that's what biblical wisdom is. And so wisdom is, it's not just knowing a bunch of things, okay? That's knowledge, and knowledge is important, but wisdom is the practical ability to see things from God's perspective. And so we've been talking about this same basic subject for a couple of chapters now. And this morning we're going to start chapter 5. And James is going to talk about the application of wisdom to the area of affluence. All right, and so this was kind of a real issue in the early church. There's a dimension of the culture at the time that I do think we need to unpack for a second before we get into the passage. And so, unlike America or any of what we would call the West, they didn't really have any vital middle class. Okay, so here and now, we do have a lot of rich people, and sadly, we also still have a lot of poor people. But in the middle is where most of us are at. All right, so we are the middle class, and so we kind of have a forward orientation in our lives. Our basic needs are met, and and then we have a little bit more to do some of the things that we want to do or buy some of the things that we want to buy. But in the ancient world, it wasn't really like that. Okay, so there was really no such thing as the middle class. So you either owned and controlled, or you were owned and controlled. And in fact, in the Roman Empire, the number of slaves actually outnumbered the number of free people. So they had these radical extremes of wealth in their society, and so it shouldn't surprise us very much to find that this was also the case inside the church. And so as the church is being established and people are coming in, the same social places that they came from are taking root in the church. And so it sort of creates a little bit of dissonance. And so that's why in chapter 2, James had to say that they have a problem in their little group with people getting favoritism, if you remember that, right? Favoritism for being rich at the expense of the poor. And so that just isn't God's way. And so after a couple of chapters now, James is looping back around, and he's going to address this issue of affluence. And so we're going to want to apply some of these principles to our own situation, even if our situation is a little different. So this is this first half of our text for this morning, and so this is stuff that can be a little bit hard-hitting. This is James 5, starting in verse 1. It says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure." So this is the same literary technique that James has used earlier in this book. Jesus did this sometimes. It's used a lot in the Old Testament. There's exaggeration, there's colorful language, and the point mostly is to arrest our attention and focus it on the thing that he's trying to drive home. All right, so that's like clearly what's going on here so far. Then verse 4 says, "Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. You have lived luxuriously on the earth, and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man, he does not resist you. So the world that James lives in is a very black and white place. All right, at least that's the way he communicates it. And he's basically saying that affluence is it's a real problem for us, really. And he starts with saying, "Come now, you rich." And so the first thing that we really need to understand this morning is, like, what's he talking about? Okay, what are the underlying things that he's saying that might also speak into our situation? And so we're starting with this thing that he says here, "Come now, you rich." Okay, what does it mean to be rich? What is affluence? And I would say that the simplest way to describe affluence is that if you have resources beyond your needs, then you're affluent. Okay, and so, like, the real needs of yourself and your family are met. You've got some extra as well to save or to spend on things you don't really need, but that you would like to have maybe. And, affluence comes from a variety of factors. Okay, and a lot of our affluence comes from the fact that we happen to be in an affluent culture. Okay, it's just easy to be affluent here because our entire culture has gained a level of affluence that we just perceive as normal. All right, so the capacity to seize resources is very high because the amount of available resources is very high. And of course, the level of affluence does differ by individual because it's somewhat dependent on things like, intellect and education and personality and whether or not you even want any. And so we end up measuring these things like intellect and education about one another in financial terms. Okay, it's also interesting that the latest couple of batches of census information shows a widening gap between the rich and the poor in our culture. And see if you can believe this, white families in this country have a median income that's about double what the median income is of our black counterparts. So it's a little bit disturbing. And you have to start to wonder what the factors are that contribute to affluence or the lack of affluence. So it's a significant issue because affluence is not neutral from the biblical point of view. Okay, the idea of wealth has a great potential for good, but also for evil. And from a spiritual point of view, wealth is a pretty volatile substance. Okay, so Jesus had some sober warnings about wealth, and one time he put it like this. This is Matthew 19:24 and 25. It says, "Truly I say to you, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I say to you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." All right, I've heard this passage taught and talked about like a number of different ways. But the way that I read this is that Jesus is doing the same thing that James likes to do, where he uses exaggerated language and Jewish hyperbole to make his point. Okay, camels don't fit through needles. All right, that's absurd, and that's the point that Jesus is making. Okay, wealth is a huge barrier to the things of God. And James has identified some of the reasons why that is the case in the paragraph that we read, all right? And we're going to get to that stuff. But the question that we're going to ask first is, who is he talking about? Okay, who are the affluent, and what does he mean by the rich? And, I think that we automatically go, well, he must mean like Bill Gates and Donald Trump, all right, and other people that are just super wealthy. But he says you. who are rich. And he's talking to people that are within the group that he's writing to. And so there are some inequities of wealth inside this group that he thinks he needs to speak to. And so in contemporary application, who would we be talking about? Because it isn't me, right? Like, I'm not rich. Let's look at this. You may recognize this finished slide and graphic from when Jeremiah laid into us about wealth. And so you'll probably notice that we're going to retread some of that same ground here. But as much work as I put into this graphic in Jeremiah, I decided to steal some additional graphics to like sort of help keep your interest and then add a sense of real height to this whole thing. And so if the entire population of the world was 600 people, then we're going to look at what the current distribution of wealth in the world would look something like. All right. And so a good solid 40% of those 600 people live in like Povertyville. Okay. And so that means that their household income is about $430 per year. 40% of the world lives in that place. So like Rio, Mumbai, huge swaths of Africa, Haiti. Okay, everything that these people do is for the sake of survival when you're looking at about $1 a day. So education's not an option for their children. Economic advancement's not really going to happen. No house. Very little fresh water. Okay, these people are living on like the ragged edge of survival. And economists call this economic class the desperately poor. And a lot of our world is made up of the desperately poor. And so this silly graphic is supposed to represent kind of what their world looks like. There's not enough nutrition for proper brain development for kids. It's really a desperate place. All right, and if you move up the cliff there, you come to Slumtown. This is another 40% of the population of the world. And it means that your annual household income is like just over $100 a month. And so at this income level, most children do receive the nutrition that they need for their brains to develop properly. One or more of your kids may be educated to a certain level. You may be in a position to own or rent a small little piece of land, and then you have the privilege of living in your little one-room building. Okay, but any little shift in the economy is going to put you right back down into Povertyville. All right, these people are right on the margin of sustenance and existence. And so Povertyville and Slumtown together make up the enormous majority of the world that we live in, about 81%. All right, and so there's this other place that we used to refer to as the Second World. This is like portions of Eastern Europe, remnants of the former Soviet Union, Southern Mediterranean basin. All right, so much of Latin and South America, places like that. And here, the standard of living is much higher. All right, it's to the tune of about $5,000 per year per household. And it's getting to the point where there's really only about 1% of the world in this place. Okay, so here there's often the opportunity for education and for a way forward for our children. Maybe at this level there's access to the rudiments of medical care, whereas the places below this do not have that opportunity. All right, and so then we move on up the cliff here to the place that we all know and love. That's Pleasantville. All right, about 18% of the population of the world. All right, it's less than 100 of the 600 that we said make up the entire population of the world. Looks great, right? But look at the number that defines this segment of the population. Okay, $26,000 per year per household. Okay, so check it out. This number defines the poverty line in the United States. Okay, that's it. The number for the poverty line in the United States is $25,000 a year per household of four. Okay, so we call poverty something that is still higher than where almost 80% of the world lives. It's a weird scale, don't you think? But it's all a matter of perspective. And the reality is that the vast majority of the households here this morning are not at $26,000 per household. Okay, most of us are closer to relating to something like 50 or 75 or 100, all right, per household. Sometimes quite a lot more than that. And so we are many, many times more wealthy than the wealthiest of the wealthy in the world. Okay? And so for that reason, there's like a certain sense of vertigo that comes from looking down from like the exalted plateau that we're on. All right? It's really hard to look down from where we are and even conceive of the mass of misery that exists below us. Okay? There it is, right? Like that's the poverty line in America at the top in relation to 82% of the rest of the world. Pretty remarkable. Okay, so who's James talking to? Right? Come now, you rich. He's talking to you. Okay? Who could he possibly be talking to if it's not you? It's us, man. We're living at a level of wealth that would be unimaginable in the world of James. Okay, the poorest of us are many times more wealthy than virtually any other place and time on the planet. And it's really important for us to understand the scope of this thing. And we need to see that the God that we serve is a God of the whole world. Okay, he's not just our God. He's a God to all these people. And if we're telling the truth about where our Pleasantville is, then it would be ridiculously higher even than the graphic that I just showed. If that height was 26,000, right? Like imagine where your house actually would be. And the thing that James says to those who are rich is weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. So what we're going to do is think about affluence as James does here. Okay, we're going to look at it as the spiritual issue that it is. And so we're going to break it down into the 4 pressure points that James brings up in this paragraph. And so this is 4 things about wealth that are very dangerous spiritually. Okay, so wealth can be a great blessing. The Bible is not against wealth. Okay, but the Bible is very realistic about the power of wealth among fallen people like you and me. Okay, and the first is what he says here. Okay, so weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. And so this must have been very ironic for the readers, the original readers of James. And so in the ancient world, especially if you're Hebrew, to possess wealth would be a sign of the blessings of God. Okay, I must be doing something right. Look at what God has given me. Okay, so there's the sense that God is with you because the universe has selected you to possess a bunch of stuff. Okay, and that's not just the ancient world. It's kind of how we look at it too. Okay, if we do not have wealth, then we kind of think that God's holding out on blessing us. Okay, we maybe have done something wrong. There's a sort of a karma principle that underlies the way that the world looks and thinks about the things that we're talking about here this morning. And James is taking a pretty ironic twist when he says that you who are rich, not so much with the blessing. Okay, he's not saying that they're in a place of blessing. He's talking about the place of misery that they're in. He's talking about the fact that there are empty promises that wealth makes. Okay, and so we look for things in wealth that wealth itself cannot deliver. And so Jesus says, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. That word is pleonexia. And not only does this word sound like a disease, it kind of has that meaning too. Okay, there's a drive to own and to possess, and it preoccupies our thinking, and it defines success for us. Okay, so that's what Jesus is talking about when he uses this word greed. Okay, we perceive it as a virtue in our culture. Okay, and then he gives us the reason here. It says, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. All right, it's kind of an important point, especially for those of us who tend to define ourselves by our possessions, even subconsciously. Okay, and the things that we've accomplished and the things that we've amassed are all tributes to our own greatness. And here in Luke 12, all right, Jesus is saying that not even when a person has an abundance of stuff does his life consist of his possessions. You can amass all you want, okay, but there's no measurable correlation between wealth and happiness. Okay, and Jesus is trying to make the point that affluence is not worth the sacrifice. Okay, there's a sickness in our culture, and, pleonexia is as good a name for it as any. It's this, ideal of acquiring newer and better and nicer and faster and more, okay, as a means of defining who we are. Okay, it's this stuff that communicates why I matter and, what it means to be me. And we're willing, as a culture, to sacrifice all things on the altar of pleonexia. All right, there's some significant facts here, I think. From the 1960s to today, the average American household works more than twice as much as the generation that came before us. Okay, we're working twice as hard. And, of course, we're living in houses that are twice as big. Okay, square footage, footprints of houses built today really are twice the size of houses built in the 50s and 60s. It's a little bit crazy. We work crazy hours, right? We imperil our health. We ignore our children so that we can achieve success, right? Fight Club said advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy stuff we don't need to impress people we don't like. And the things you own end up owning you. All right, at this moment in America, we're in a bit of a mess. Okay, we're coming to the realization that this may be the first generation of Americans who are not as affluent as their parents. And there's a sense of frustration and failure as we labor under this mirage about what wealth even is. So social science and scripture absolutely converge on this point. There is no measurable correlation between your level of affluence and your level of happiness. Okay, it's an established fact. Once you get past a certain level of poverty, more wealth does not advance your happiness. Okay, but we've been brought up with the lie that it does. Okay, we've adopted that idea as a culture and we have internalized it as individuals, and it's kind of a problem for us. All right, so there's also a hidden assumption about affluence. There's a hook that comes along with it. Okay, wealth seeks our devotion. And in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, Jesus says, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. And what he's saying is that what you care about, what you treasure, does have a hold on you. Okay, it calls to you, and it conforms you to what it's about. And so think about this. Like, what is it that you think about? Right? Where's your head? What do you fantasize about? And when the answer to those things, when we define those things in material terms, we've bought into the lie of the world. Okay, we're pouring out our lives for the sake of this assumption that wealth is the key to happiness. Okay, and your heart is just called to the place where your treasure is. Okay, and there's a warning that comes in applying this principle. So given the inherent power of wealth, the affluent must be very clear about how we're serving God with our lives. Okay, that's us. And the level of clarity needs to be there more for us than it does for anyone else in the world, because the competition for our hearts is so great, because of the culture that we live in, the affluence of the culture that we live in. This culture of like comfort and acquisition is where our heads are at. Okay, if we're not actively taking a stand to say that what we're really about is actively serving God with my life. All right, it's just inevitable that this will overcome us if we're not completely clear on this point, constantly resisting the pull. Okay, study after study has shown that in the area of cultural values and the way that people make decisions about how they live and how they spend their money in America, the evangelical church is not statistically different than anybody else. All right, we are not significantly different than anybody else. That's the power of the American world system bearing in on the church. And the only way that we're going to have any real impact is to be about something that's not finance driven. All right, next thing, verse 2. He says, your riches have rotted and your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and the rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It's in the last days that you've stored up your treasure. So that sounds unpleasant. All right, what's he talking about? He's kind of talking about hoarding. All right, he's talking about, hoarding is a strange word to use because it has like images of stacked magazines that aren't worth anything. But he's talking about having like so much stuff that you can't even spend it. Okay, your gold is just piling up and your gold is rusting. All right, listen, gold doesn't rust. Okay, it's a noble metal. I'm a physics teacher. All right, so again, this is an exaggeration. He's making clear his point. And so all your cool clothes, they have like moths eating them. You got more shoes than Imelda Marcos. All right, this room is too young to even know who that is. Okay, you haven't even seen some of your shoes in a while. Okay, when I got married, I owned 5 trucks. And when we moved to Florida, I got rid of 4 motorcycles and still moved 6 of them down here. Okay, I have at times refused to count my guns because I didn't want to be able to answer that question. How many knives does one person need? All right, so I get this. All right, this is talking to me. Maybe you can find a less obvious way to relate to what he's talking about, but it probably somewhat applies to you also. But amassing stuff is like an empty legacy compared to a wealth of generosity, relational success, and purposeful living. Okay, amassing stuff is a witness against you. Okay, real wealth and real witness for Christ, it's in these other things. And so maybe you have in your mind, like I do, that you can do both. Maybe. All right? But from the perspective of eternity, only one of these two kinds of wealth has any value at all. It's all stacks of magazines that aren't worth anything. Okay, being able to invest ourselves generously in the meeting of the needs of other people and having real relationships that actually work, where we serve and love one another, is living for a purpose that's greater than our pocketbook. Okay, and as parents, it's a really important piece of things. Okay, we put a lot of pressure on our kids to succeed and to do all the right things so that they can get into all the right schools, so that they can get all the right jobs, so that they can make all the right money. Okay, the pressure of all the coaches and all the teachers in this kind of direction, and like our children are trying to navigate all that. And how can they do this if we ourselves are really still struggling with this? Okay, and so many of us have really bought this rap. And so we try to keep our kids busy so that they don't get into like sex and drugs, and we keep them successful at school so that they'll do well in life. And really, we're just thinking like everybody else. Okay, we're part of the machine. And so which do you think would have a greater impact on a childhood and a development into adulthood? A bigger, nicer bedroom, or parents who are engaged in their community and with their kids? Parents who are teaching their kids how to successfully acquire the kind of wealth that's eternal. Teaching them about the kind of wisdom that James is describing in this letter. All right, so that would be successful parenting. And so if we're all about stuff, then our kids are going to learn that, no matter what it is that we say to them. Okay, so this is a values issue, and it's a spiritual issue. And there's very real competition for your heart on this point. Third thing. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. So this is about like exploitation. He's talking about the withholding of pay. Okay, so this is not such a big problem in our world, but in places of great poverty, this is still a real issue, all right? So the situation is desperate enough and opportunities are few enough that just the promise of pay is worth the risk. Okay, even if it, has been many months since there's been any pay. So I have a friend that once visited a brick factory in Brazil where 10-year-old children carried clay from giant pits to the furnaces for 16 hours a day. And they did it indefinitely for no pay at all, because the owners of the factory would sell the company to a relative every month, and the new owner was not responsible to pay the wages that the previous owner had neglected to pay. Okay, so that's just slavery. And this is the kind of exploitation that James is talking about here. Okay, not compensating a laborer for their work is sin. Okay, so we don't possess wealth in a vacuum. We possess wealth in a world with like limited resources. In exploiting the work of others, we're taking from them the resources that they need. And so we're accountable to God for just distribution of God's resources. So that's a main theme that runs through the Old Testament. One of the things that Israel kept getting in trouble for was that they were unjust with the poor and with the vulnerable. And this is what James is bringing to the attention of the reader here. And I think that we can all agree on this one. Okay? So this is not so hard hitting for us. Not such a big deal, not such a thing in our case. But it may be worth considering that ours is not the only case that exists in the world today. Again, it is the entirety of the world that God is concerned with. Okay, so we will give account of how we treat other people. And we went over part of Matthew 25 last week, right? Remember, inasmuch as you did to the least of these, you did to me. Okay, in 1 John, John puts it this way. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? It's inconceivable for John that a person who claims to know God is unwilling and callous towards the physical needs of the people around him. All right, we'll be held accountable for this issue. Okay, and that brings us to our final point. He says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. So do we even really hear the warning that James is trying to give us? Luxury, life of wanton pleasure. Look at all of our media, right? Our culture is telling us that this is exactly what we ought to be pursuing with all the gusto that we can muster. All right, the imagery here that James gives us is like that of a pig at the trough gorging itself and thinking that it's got it made. Okay, but that's short-sighted of the pig. The pig is off to slaughter. And so James is saying that our perspective is just as short-sighted. Okay, when we're getting what we can get, for me, then we're not understanding the big picture. And do we hear that warning? We have a pretty unique opportunity. Okay, and this is increasingly a burden that I'm wrestling with, and so I'm going to give you the opportunity to share that burden. What are we supposed to do with the incredible wealth that we do possess? Okay, why would God give us so much prosperity? Why are we wildly comfortable, like beyond the expectations of almost all the rest of the world? In a material sense. Maybe it's so that in those places in the world where the gospel of Jesus Christ is expanding in incredible numbers, we can fuel what they're doing. Okay, the message of Christ is not growing here. Okay, it's growing in places of great poverty. There are more Christians living underground in China than exist in America. Okay, impoverished India is experiencing an explosion in the number of Christians. And these are places that have great need. Okay, God has raised us up with the opportunity to partner with the world and to resource the world. People who study missions are very clear, right? Like tens of thousands of churches are being established every week. And it's in places that have nothing in the way of resources. And so our opportunity is to share in this incredible work by sharing resources. And so you can expect that if God decides to grow this little community and we have resources beyond our needs, at a point where we can get the city to stop sending us citations, we will not be expending the majority of the resources that we have on ourselves. Okay, we'll first be looking to see how we can make an impact on our community at large and the needy and the vulnerable that we have here. And resources beyond that, there's going to be a strong push from me and the rest of the church leadership to send those resources to people that are doing God's work around the world. Okay, and so I would encourage you to consider that for yourselves individually. Don't wait for the church to do it. Okay, you do it. Where do your extra resources go? Okay, Haiti, Brazil, India, Cambodia, Indonesia, China. All right, there are people who are establishing church communities and who have almost nothing in the way of resources that we could and should be helping to provide. Okay, we could exponentially impact eternity in this way, and it would help you, okay? It would change your heart. It's like praying, not because God needs it, it's because you need it. Okay, and I'm not trying to sell you this idea. I just think that we need to expand the way that we look at this issue and think about the whole thing globally the way that God looks at this thing. Let's see if we can wrap this up. There are some spiritual vital signs that relate to this discussion, I think. And the first one is, like, is there a sense of urgency in spiritual matters in your life? A sense sort of that today matters. Okay, there's a lot at stake and there's stuff going on, and do you feel that way? God's got a plan today for you and your resources. That would be actually a pretty healthy thing. Okay, and the thing that kills that is material comfort. Okay, material comfort kind of takes the urgency right out of everything. Okay, we anesthetize ourselves to like a blasé, tepid irrelevance as spiritual people. Okay, that is an effect of material pursuit. So how are we doing with that? All right, is there any feeling of urgency about what God is seeking to accomplish through you right now? And what kind of gratitude are we driven by? You ever had like somebody unexpectedly buy you lunch? Okay, you're grateful, right? In a way. It's a nice gesture. Thank you for that, but I could have bought my own lunch, right? So that's not the kind of gratitude that we're talking about here. Okay, we're talking about the kind of gratitude that's expressed in the Lord's Prayer. Okay, Jesus tells his disciples to pray like this. He says, "Give us this day our daily bread." It's an interesting prayer. It's a prayer of someone who's on the margin. It's the prayer of someone who's trusting God for whether or not they are going to eat that day. Okay? Trusting God with whether or not they're going to have any food at all that day. It's a different kind of gratitude. Okay? When you're provided something that you cannot provide yourself. So how hungry are we spiritually? Right? How much do we have the sense that we just can't believe how good God is? And are we so grateful to God that we're just looking everywhere for an opportunity to share that? Okay, that's the thing about the Christian life. Okay, we're not supposed to be motivated by a set of rules where we're just like determined to do the right things. There are no 7 habits or 12 steps or 5 pillars or 8-fold path, right? Like, it's not how this works. At its core, the Christian life is like a thankful response to God because he met us where we are and he pursued a relationship with us. He drew you into his family. He overcame the barrier that was between you and him. Okay, on your own, you're an orphan. But through the cross of Christ, God has paid the way to make you part of his family and to liberate you from your bondage to yourself and to sin. All we have to do is come to the place where we realize that we're on the outside looking in. And we make the choice to receive this provision from God that is forgiveness through the cross. It opens the door to relationship with him. And so when we're at the place where we realize that what God offers, we can't get for ourselves, we cannot make ourselves alive to God. Okay, we cannot make ourselves right before God. And he's chosen by his mercy to welcome us into his presence. And then we are so grateful. Okay, we are so grateful because we are so aware of how far we are from him on our own. When we can see that we're forgiven for everything, past, present, and future, okay, we are motivated by that gratitude to live our lives for him and to share our gratitude with other people. Next vital sign. Whether we have a narrow or a broad world of concern. And so we may find that we have a problem with affluence when we can see that our sphere of interest is so narrow that it's essentially really just all about us. Okay? My predictable life, my stuff, the people who make me feel good about being me. Pretty much it. All right, that's where much of our culture is. Okay, we just want our little niche that we can control, and life is pretty much all about protecting that. And yet the place where a person is really freed from worries about their financial life and worries about other things is when they're really able to give themselves over to Christ and all their resources over to him. Okay, this person tends to have a very broad view of the world. Their concerns are very broad. Okay, there's room for other people and their needs. Okay, other people's needs really call to this person, and they're able to sacrifice for the good of this other person. Material preoccupation keeps us very locked in our own narrow field of concern. Okay, we just aren't interested in very much else. And so are you growing in this area? Or are you kind of the same as you've always been? And to the extent that you're struggling here, like materialism is very much in the way. You don't have to be rich to be a materialist. All right, think about that. Some of us feel very tight, right? Like we're barely getting by. Okay, like $65,000 came into my family last year, and man, are we poor, right? Cannot understand how anybody gets by on any less than what I make, right? Gonna have to borrow some more money, and more money, and more money. It's kind of where we're at. It's kind of where our culture lives. Okay, we got to have, and we're willing to put any financial stewardship to God on hold in order to continue acquiring what we feel like we're entitled to. You imagine someone trying to get by on $1 a day? Trying to get their head around how we feel poor? It's inconceivable. It's grotesque. All right, so instead, like a person who gets it is aware of the abundance that they've been blessed with and is prepared to be open-handed with that abundance. So are we open or are we closed to wise counsel about our money? That's a tough one here. We don't talk about certain things, right? Politics is one in some situations. But I'm going to just say it. We don't really talk about money. Okay, we don't talk about how much we make. We don't talk about how much we spend or how much we give. And yet so many people are in bondage to this issue. It's one of the reasons that we don't reveal the secrets. And so, are we open to wise counsel on these things in your financial life? Do you have any people that you're willing to talk to and are willing to lay out what you're spending your money on and hear what they have to say about it? Sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? Right? Why do you think we're so protective of our financial autonomy? You think you would like to hear what the Bible says about your financial habits from a trusted friend? I wouldn't. And because we ignore God and we've shut out our community on this issue, it has complete freedom to destroy our internal lives. Okay, we should be trying to be open about what is a crucial spiritual issue. Lastly, do we have a disciplined and sacrificial pattern of generosity in our lives? This is where it ends, man. We have like a stewardship from God, and we will answer to him on the distribution of the resources that he gave to us. And the question is not how much. It's whether or not we're disciplined and sacrificial in our giving. Are we able to give in ways that are potentially painful for us? It may mean that we go without a little bit so that some other person can have. All right? And none of this is out of some sense of legalism. It's a gratitude response. It's the response of a steward that really understands that the resources are not theirs anyway. And I think that if we were vital in these areas that are on the slide here, then we would stand out as a community of believers. And we would be able to make like a real difference. God would be able to make a real difference through us. And we're going to be able to fund and support and come alongside God's work all around the world. Okay, and then we'll have the blessing of participation that Paul so often talks about. All right, so there you have it. We just finished the hardest parts of James. All right, the rest is way easier. But we had to get through this.